call the meeting to order. I don't see any members of the public, so let's move right to the consent agenda. Marla, are you prepared as usual?
Yeah, I make a motion that we approve the consent agenda with the following items: school board meeting minutes, November 6, 2018, and approval of warrants.
Okay. I'm sorry, did someone want to pull one of these items?
I just had a question on the minutes. I didn't want to pull it, I just was wanted to ask a question.
Okay, technically we shouldn't do that, but go ahead.
The question was, is there a date anywhere as to these minutes? I was looking for a date at the top.
It's usually at the top. Yeah, it says November 6th.
It's in green.
It's in green. Maybe you printed it in black and white.
Yeah, I did.
So
I did.
see if you turn around now, the date is up right there.
Okay.
That's the
Okay,
problem.
Thank you.
Yep.
all right. All those in favor
mysterious.
of the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Of the same name. All right, let's move right into the first quarter financial review.
Yep, and we have Kathy Barron is with us this evening. Between some technology challenges that I had and other technology challenges that I ran into, plus the holidays, receiving everything now. Please feel open that this is just the beginning. If you have questions, we can come back, I can answer them, have Kathy answer them offline to individuals. So don't feel like this is a one and done, but it's also first quarter. Kathy will explain some about the timing of first quarter has a little less impact than what we see later in the year.
Right, right. Yeah, in the first quarter, you know, the majority of the salaries don't start until the end of August. So you're going to see, what you would think of as a quarter being a quarter of everything is always much smaller in the first quarter. As we're gearing up, you know, we only have the 12-month folks there for July and into August. And so it's not real representative of the numbers. But the next one you see, that'll be the end of December 31st. We'll give you a better indication of, you know, where we're progressing. Brian and I are trying to watch very carefully this year on how people are spending. When we look at the reports, and
You have in front of you a comparison, and this is one of the reasons why it took a little bit longer. This is in the format that we've been doing the budget. So instead of seeing it, I think the reports that have been previously coming to the board were by object groupings, which we don't ever report on or budget that way. You know, it was just a report that we were using.
right.
So this has now been formatted to be the same way that we're doing the budgeting, so it's grouped into those areas, and it's comparative. On the slides, just in case we had audience, what it's gonna be is FY19 only. So, just so you know, you have everything in front of you that Kathy will be referring to and will be on the screen, but for our television audience, we'll have some slides.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're pretty much on track with our revenues. We actually were quite fortunate this year. We'll get into the audit a little bit because we have begun the audit. We're actually 3/4 of the way through it. And because of the fund balance that we carried over, and the fact that the first quarter is a little leaner with expenses than the second quarter, we have not had to borrow any money to date. So that's going to be a huge savings in interest expense. And we're actually earning revenue on that money that's in the bank also. So that's a plus. So we're a little ahead of the game right now on our revenues. We have run into a little bit with the states transitioning over to a new grants management system, and they're trying to get the kinks ironed out. They've had their share this year with technology also. That we are a little behind on our state revenues, on our grants, which are a reimbursable grant. So as we spend it, we get money. But to get the approval to be able to spend it has been some lag with the state, but they're now geared back up. They're now on track. So we'll move forward with that. And you'll see a lot of differences in the next quarter, as we, kind of gain momentum with that. But everything else, as we go through, it has pretty stable, pretty on track with where we were. If we look at the quarterly reports alone, you'll see the difference of how much we have remaining, but it's actually a little more useful to kind of look at the comparative where we were last year and where we were this year. So are we a lot higher in a certain expense, or are we a lot lower in a certain expense, and what those anomalies might be, what those variances are. But as you look at the comparison report, you're gonna see that they're pretty much, the expenses are right on track from 18 to 19. What is a little harder to look at is, as you look at the variances, it might look like one is really high and one is really low, but you have to look at the adjusted budget, and that could be higher or lower. So it's one of those things that it might look different from one year to the next, but that may be because we're either budgeting less or budgeting more. An example is that as I was looking at the board services expenses and going, gee, how come it's got such a big variance, even though we've spent almost the exact same amount of money? Well, we budgeted less in FY19 than we did 18. Well, why was that? Well, we had the audits. We went from 5 audits down to 1 audit, so we are substantially lower what we budgeted for audits. So those are the type of things, and those are the questions that, as you kind of look at these reports and you're wondering why there's variances, those are the kinds of questions, throw those my way or throw them Brian's way and say, so why are there differences here? And so it's kind of hard just to look at a single report in front of you and really be able to dissect it and understand it just sitting here. So anytime, if you want to send me an email, I'm more than happy to address any questions that you might have on some of these things, some of these items. I think we're doing, really well. We've not had any surprises, anything that's popped up that, that unexpected expenses. We are a little bit more in tune this year with what the budget is all about, and we're going to get even better on that. Last year, it was kind of a very difficult year with the merger of what were we really going to need, what were we not going to need. But as we are moving into 19, we've got a better sense of what those expenses were, what those costs are, and how we are going to move forward into 20 with those. So that being said, we have started the audit, and I know everybody's kind of excited and interested to find out where we're headed with that. I'm very interested because it was, how do you pull 5 entities together and come up with a real number? And the auditors have been quite impressed. I feel we've actually moved right along. I had 3 of them in my office for a week and a half. Well, that's a lot of fun. So nothing else gets done, but so we have progressed on that. And so I had said, what do you think of a large fund balance like we had? And they said, basically, it's not. If you think about, we are a $60 million general support grant industry entity right now. $6 million fund balance is not a lot. I went, oh, okay. So yeah, if you put it in that perspective, they're right. That isn't. So we will know. I have a few more things to wrap up for them. The most difficult piece has been the thing I held for the last is fixed assets. Everybody is so interested in fixed assets, not, but but it's an important component of the fixed asset. And so Bruce and I are going to take our drive around tomorrow and find out what's really here, what's not here, what's kind of went away. And so we'll wrap that up and we'll be able to get the last of the documents to the auditors. I'm hoping once they have the last of the things that I need to supply to them, that they'll be able to get us something hopefully within a month, I hope. I will ask them what their thoughts are on that, if they have everything. They seem to be quite comfortable when they left on just before the holiday that they had most everything that they needed. Then they would shoot me a few questions, and I think we're doing really good. I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Thank you so much,
that
Kathy.
we're still good.
Questions or comments for Kathy? Brendan?
It's a very small number to be asking about, but I am curious. So looking at the actual is Q1 over Q1, FY18 over FY19, other income went from 23 to almost 60,000. What kinds of things make up other income?
Other income could be E-rate money, and we never really know, what we're gonna get depending on the year. Other income could be, the building rental would be in, yes, it could be building rental, or no, that would be in
On
rentals.
this report, the rentals is separated.
Is separated, okay. I don't know, Brendan, I'd have to dive in and see what it is, but usually
Obviously,
we
it's a
put
very
E-rate
small
in there.
number, but I was just kind of curious as to
What goes into other and
Yeah,
miscellaneous
it wouldn't
and,
be like ticket revenue from the rink or anything.
No, the rink would be
Central
separate,
office.
and then rentals would be separate as well.
Okay.
And it, we can drill down on the report, probably partly just because it's a report that Kathy's not overly familiar with, just to trying to organize it this way.
Right.
And we can also at times kind of expand it there. but
parking fees might be in there,
Okay.
because they're not really a rental, so they.
Not this year.
Oh, that's right, we didn't
That's a
have.
freebie.
That was a freebie this year, so no, that's not it, but I definitely can
It's a
find
budget
out for you.
variance.
How about interest or the gate at a football game?
Investment and loss has its own line.
Investment,
Oh,
well,
that's
yeah.
your interest.
Yep.
We'll drill down on it.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Not a big deal.
Healing.
I'm recalling that a couple months ago, we heard about sort of a missing $1 million because of miscommunication in the district and the state.
Yeah.
I think that was from like capital project
It
or
was
something.
capital.
What are the ongoing effects of that? Is that anything that has an impact on this report?
It doesn't impact this report because capital is reported out in a separate fund. So what might impact that is if we decide as a group that some of the items that are not going to be able to be covered because we don't have the $1 million, that we still want to move forward, but we'd have to do that through the general fund. And as we kind of look, and I think that's one of the things we had talked about over to, once the audit is finished, is kind of see what our fund balance really is, to take some of that residual fund balance and be able to do some of the projects that we're unable to do because of the $1 million that we don't have.
Right.
But it was kind of, let's see what the fund balance, and we know we have a comfortable $6 million fund balance, and I don't think that's gonna change. Once the audit's done, I see no indication that there's gonna be any big difference, in that. So it is important. Now Bruce has been working with Brian to try to decide what projects were on the list of the to-do list, and then what needs to be done and what are really vital, and I think he also was kind of working with the new budget for 20, rethinking how we do capital, so that maybe it should be, some of those things are routine maintenance and really shouldn't be on a capital schedule, but just be considered as part of our routine maintenance in the building, out of the general fund. So those are, yes, it's a great question, and those are the things that we need to continue to address, and as soon as the audit's done, I would imagine we're gonna present to you and say, these are the projects that we still think that really need to be done this year, and would we use some of the fund balance to cover those costs?
Thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments?
Yeah, frogs. This document is going to be posted to our website?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. It's on the board site now, up in the one that is part of the notes is linked to, but we can definitely post it.
Because in the last week, I've had a couple of phone calls
Yep,
that have come in, and they've been saying, how's life happening financially?
yeah,
And I said, last report was, so this would be nice to be able to say.
yeah,
It's
I'd also
there.
really like to house our audit on our website, have a financial page that has our audit, and we do a sort of a reporting to the IRS as well, and other financial documents that we have, I think would be good to be up on the website. And this is all public information, so.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah,
Yep.
it's,
I think we're still trying to refine and make sure that the word like intergov makes sense to like a general public. So some of this has just kind of gotten lost in what we're most familiar with. So your view and perspective of seeing it for the first time can be helpful in saying, you know, why don't you spell that whole word out? Because then it can be more meaningful to people.
Okay, Kim?
To that, and that wasn't my question, but to that, maybe like a glossary or like a definition section.
Funny you should say that.
Because you might then
Yeah.
be able to put what's sort of captured in each of
Kind
those
of a
lines.
key to what each
Yeah,
of these-
that could be helpful. Thinking about this with respect to the common chart of accounts, is this a report that we're gonna see even when we've transitioned? Is this tied to, related to,
The
in any
function,
way
yeah,
related
it's,
to the new system?
New
this
chart
is
account.
ordered by primary functions. There could be, you know, some further refinements in how the functions ultimately work, but for the general purposes, this is also the functions
Those
that
charts are gonna
the-
come into
the
these
state
same
works on,
functions.
so,
Yeah.
Perfect,
Yes.
thank you.
Yep.
While we're getting used to a new thing.
And then Brendan.
So, partially responding to Diane, when I do the takeaways, I usually work with Ben to make sure that any like documentation is included, you know, with a link, so you can point people in that direction. To that, I'm wondering, Brian, would it be okay if maybe sometime in the next week or so, like I sat down and had a chat with you so that I could better put this in layman's terms to a general public that's going to click on this link and then be like, what does original, adjusted, actual, and variance
Yeah.
mean? Because, you know, while we work in this stuff, honestly, you know, and I probably am one of the least experienced people here with this, some of it goes like beyond me just because I don't have, you know, a budgetary background. So I think I would be great to
Yeah.
be the dummy that you'd have to explain it to.
It would be so valuable as just to precede the budget, because when we look at the budget, we'll be looking at 19 budget adjusted year to date to what a projected 20 budget would look like. And so that was one of the reasons of really wanting to get something that we can just keep building off of, and that we're not changing sort of, and we can improve it. We can
Helpful.
get something to make sense once
Yeah.
and then reuse it.
Okay, Brendan?
So, I'm wondering if this is a categorization issue, but I see that, for the first quarter of this year, we've had $130,000 in expenditures for social work services, where last year, first quarter, we had 0?
Yeah, I think that's a categorization,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
Yep.
because we definitely did.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else? Kathy, thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of the audit.
Thank you.
And are you going to Johnson?
I'm headed to Johnson. Yes.
At CC?
I will. Thank Thank you you. so much for all your work, Kathy, Oh, really. You're very welcome.
That'd be awesome.
Throw any questions you have my way. I'm more than happy to
Thank you.
address them.
Thanks. I'm sure I'll have some.
Thank you.
One second. Spend time with it. Okay, our next agenda item comes from the goals, and we will see promise of merger updates a couple of times throughout the year, as we did last year. So, Brian, are you gonna take this?
I am, yep. Beth and I
Okay.
had practiced a sort of a live action theater with delivering this, but she's not here.
We can
so
get her on the big screen, I think.
Would not be good for any of us, I don't think. So we, in front of you and also on the screen and in your board documents and in the share, there's a promise of merger. And what we're doing, Beth and I have been working to sort of take the pulse of the district, talking with the directors, the principals, some staff, and we have expectations of moving that into also talking with the students as we get later into the year, because I think both of us believe that the promise has to be felt by, you know, the district and ultimately felt by the public that voted for the merger. So in a recent meeting and talking with the directors, these are the items that they highlighted as they work through on teams to say that, you know, the leadership has experienced, because of the merger, a common pre-K continuous improvement plan, which, you know, just even today came up, and somebody expressed their appreciation to Beth that the continuous improvement plan keeps coming up. It keeps coming up. You know, that the fact that we walked through the continuous improvement plan and did a facilitated exercise with 900 staff during the in-service is different. It's real, and it's not going away, and it has our theory of action, our values, our outcomes, and our intentions. So that's nice, and it is a continuous improvement plan for the whole pre-K-12. The school leaders have a greater PLC to share and learn, and this was the hope in kind of creating the educational leadership PLC, was that we do readings and we do reflections, and we try to grow as a team and as individuals, both on our instructional practices as well as the operational. In security, we've been able to, with the merger, create a single district security person supporting all schools. Bill Laware is that security person. He has spent time in Westford, he spent time in all the schools working, and it's also allowed us to make sure that we were meeting up with the standard safety protocols and response protocols. And I think we've got an incredible partnership now, rebuilding and getting revitalized with our public safety officials. So that's now happening, that once a month all our principals are meeting with all the public safety and first responders to go over and do training. Our next one's coming up on the 18th to do some active shooter and event training. So, in curriculum and assessment, for me as a former school board member at the Union High School level, just a common student data system that's in place and will continue to be worked on and strengthened and utilized. The sharing of teachers across a common PLC time, better instructional alignment. We've got the Bridges math program that is now K5 throughout the entire district, and also the Lucy Calkins literacy curriculum. In facilities, I think what we've added is more in-house expertise to all our buildings, so that all our buildings are being operated with access to our licensed electricians and plumbers and carpenters that we have on staff. We're also sharing resources, sharing best practices. Child nutrition, we're leveraging the existing capacity to serve all schools. So, you know, fresh, made from scratch soup is created at Essex Middle School and then shipped out to all the other schools. We have other schools that are doing baking and shipping out. We have schools that are doing salads and shipping out. So now we're really utilizing all our assets and also all the talents. And we're expanding farm to school to all schools where it was really strong in the town. It's now starting to see a presence from Westford to Hiawatha. And then also, as some of the smaller things, is that we've been able to make unified sports available across the district. And we've been, I think one of the clearest evidence of erasing boundaries is to do the voluntary transfer of families able to apply, not to, they may change to a different end of the street, but now they don't have to change school. So that is one of those things that is clearly was impossible before, and so it is nice to, as clear evidence of the merger.
So, questions, comments?
I have a bookkeeping question. Do we have extra copies that we can give Kim? I'm seeing her trying to type from looking up there.
She can have that.
So,
There's
Because
an
it's
extra
on
copy pack
Yeah.
right there.
okay.
I believe some of these
Thank
need your
you.
signature.
We're okay. Thanks, Marla. Brendan.
There's a whole bunch of cards.
Brian, I have a
think
question
there's
about
like some last time.
opportunities for
Overall.
extracurricular activities.
Yep.
I heard an anecdotal story from a teacher at the Essex Middle School about, actually there's her perception is that there were fewer opportunities for extracurriculars, but that may have to do with transportation and not necessarily with the number of programs. So could you give an example of what those extracurricular activities, how have the opportunities expanded?
Right now they're focused, the two that have come in have been opportunities we've been able to create for Westford students that they otherwise wouldn't have had because of numbers. So they've been able to participate similar to what we've seen South Burlington and Burlington do, is been able to collaborate and move the student population of EMS and Westford School together, so that those Westford students have a chance to participate.
Yeah.
And we see that opportunity presenting itself in places as well as, in the future, maybe middle school students able to do early participation in a robotics club, where there's robotics right now happening at like Westford and so forth, but maybe we could do more and also integrate into the high school work.
Yeah.
So I think we see it as a ripe area.
Right.
It's been one of those areas that needing to take care of those major blocks first.
Yep.
And certainly, I think what you've heard is the change in times and some transportation has created a significant change, primarily for the schools in the town. Changing time starts nearly an hour, so.
Thanks.
Is it, how many families have taken advantage of that voluntary transfer? Is it 11? Is it more? Do you know?
It was
22,
27
27?
students from 21 families. I believe,
27 students from 21 families?
if I remember correctly. It's very close to that.
That's something.
That's right. Yes, I could look it up, but I'm pretty sure. That was in last.
Yep,
Last
Yep.
time.
yep. Thanks.
Other questions or comments? So I'll just say, personally, I'm looking forward to the day when we actually see student improvement, student achievement improvement. But I also recognize that that's going to take time. And I think we've put a number of the building blocks that show promise for leading to that in place. So I'm hopeful that we'll realize that goal.
And can I just say one thing, that the communications team is, as you all know, a monthly communication is going out now, and promise of the merger is one of the subtopics that will be monthly reported on to the community with updates like this. So it'll be another spot that the community can look to get those updates.
Some of these are fresher than what we've talked about before, but there still continues to be the one superintendent, the one businessman. So those will, as we get into budget,
The audits,
we'll
those kind of
move
things.
back into some of the numbers,
Right,
but we're still in search of also finding more of the story about the merger.
Exactly, right.
Okay, Kim?
Somewhat similar to what you had done in This Is Us sort of category around the budget. It's hard to know whether, because I've heard this similar anecdotal commentary from the loss of opportunities at EMS was where the anecdotal information was coming from. And so I'm just wondering if when we get to that space of This Is Us, or we're beginning to prep for budget, that we're able to provide a little more detail and fact to support the more generic statements.
Yep.
That I believe to be true, but when they're looked at broadly, it would just be helpful to understand either where people are coming from or dismiss it. It happened when we changed music at the middle school to a different time of day. Anecdotally, it seemed like it would be less attended, and that the numbers bore out very differently.
Yep.
So I think it would be helpful to have
Yep.
that more detail in our story.
Great. Anything else?
Yes.
Yeah?
When it says we have common K12 proficiencies, so does that mean that we're now assessing at common areas, or we're in a common format, or what is exactly does that mean?
So there's a process of identifying those proficiencies in the scope and sequence from a pre-K-12, and that work has been done. But I think that there's also a statement here that there still continues to be work to have that curriculum and the local assessments and all the way through. So there's an element that some of it's brand new and some of it's also new because we're aligning where we didn't have schools working together before. So the proficiencies, which goes into some of it is some of it's identified for us, some of it works within what we're able to do. So that's the element of the work that's been done, is those proficiencies have been identified in a pre-K-12 sequence.
Okay, so,
So the proficiencies for K are common across the
across,
district.
so that's not addressing programmatic assessment then?
I believe that the assessment work continues to have that be common across all the schools. I mean, like one of it, for instance, having a common bridges, so that now we have that common math program through all our K-5, then introduces the ability to now start to have common assessments, K-5, and start to work that way.
Okay, so this is being addressed at any curricular, any extra curricular formats then, so that all individuals have the equal opportunity to go into, into math, into languages, into various extracurriculars and stuff. The students have those capabilities of getting into those programs.
Can I try to?
You're gonna translate?
Well,
Thank you.
I remember a presentation that Amy Cole did at one point, and I don't remember who the group, it might have just been to the communications like a couple of years ago.
Okay.
But talking about the process of Act 77 implementation. The very first step of moving to proficiency-based learning was to identify what the proficiencies are that we're trying to get students to attain at different grade levels for different subjects.
Okay.
And this was work that was done by the whole district and has been completed. And then I think the second step was to determine which of those proficiencies are covered in different classes. So like at the high school, the proficiency of like critical thinking, which is one of the transferable skills, I guess, not a proficiency, but that would be addressed in different classes. And then if you did like a personal learning where you were like blacksmithing outside of the school, maybe you aren't learning critical learning, but you're learning some other proficiency. So it's part of like being able to do proficiency-based learning and
Okay.
grading. Does that?
Yeah, it's,
Beth is shaking her head yes, so.
Okay.
I think
The reason why we have PLCs is to do that curriculum work and break down the proficiencies.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments or questions, Patrick?
Just quick, as we're going into budget season, Brian, would it be possible to get some dollar figures on some of these mergers? Like I'm thinking like the example of not needing to hire an external contractor. You know, if that's something that we can bring to the general public and say, hey, because we have this guy in Westford who's great at electrical engineering, we did not have to go out and pay Cummings Electric
Yep.
$20,000.
yeah, most certainly.
Just, little pieces of information like that I think that the public can sort of look at and say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's, something we wouldn't have had before.
Yeah, I think that that's a necessity in the budgeting process for us to really get down to the dollars and cents of the promise of merger.
Yeah.
And so some of these have dollars to them, some of them are foundational blocks on our instructional practices that, we've invested the time, which is one of our most valuable.
Yeah, I'm just thinking since it's coming up to that point of the year, I just thought I'd toss it out there as something I'd like to see.
I think that's great. And Brian did a great job last year in framing the budget in those terms, and I expect the same again. Yeah. Okay, anything else? All right, thanks, this is great. So let's move on to the implementation of the student transportation plan.
So as on the 6th, I will deliver this in the absence of our superintendent, or at least in her full body of presence here. Pretty much the same format that we have. The last report was on November 6th. So what we started off with just an anticipated timeline update. Mountain Transit is still working its trainees through the process. We have one licensed driver that's currently on staff, and there are 5 licensed drivers that are going through the process between 4 to 6 weeks. You know that there is mandatory waiting periods if there is not a passage of a test. So even if you can't go the next day and try it again, or that afternoon, that the federal regulations for commercial driver's license require a 3-week wait. So some of this is just a matter of sort of waiting. Many of these people are on our buses as bus aides right now, or being employed in other functions for Mountain Transit. You'll see further down that, you know, one of the threats is always to lose a person as they go through a very extended training process. The timeline for current drivers in training, assuming a passage of all tests, will have us implementing transportation for the village schools in January, and for optimal introduction of transportation for all the schools, which is partly around making sure we have enough communication, that we've got enough orientation for students and community members with regards to buses coming onto our roads and being ridden, and minimizing the wait time in school. The district will wait for all 6 drivers to be ready. And I think that the school vacation break and our fluctuation in schedules actually kind of works as that it would be nearly that collision in time anyways, because while we're on school vacation, there are still days to test and days to
Good
to
start.
have. So,
Transportation questions, surprise.
Should we wait to the end?
Let's let him go
Yep.
through it, and then we'll come back and do questions.
and Beth can take all your questions. So wins, we started a process with the release days. We actually have started a process that all the administrative assistants throughout the entire district are getting together for learning, training, and reporting out. So Jamie spent about an hour with them all. It was excellent because we could have transporting, schools that have had busing for a long time would start to work with people who have never had busing ever in the history of the school. So a lot of that work was able to go through and share some stories, and also all the forms and all the data. We now currently provide them a suite of tools online for them to be able to manage and be able to report out information about our busing system. And what came back was they appreciate all those tools, they like them, and they don't want any of them to go away.
Mm-hmm.
So the difficulty of presenting multiple options means that you maintain multiple options. Bus evacuation drills have been completed by all contractors and all schools, including Hiawatha, Summit, and other schools. Even though we don't do school-to-home transportation, they do field trips and so forth. So there was some work that was done there as well. Electrical upgrades that we've been reporting on that at the Founders Garage have been completed. This greatly improves our safety, reliability, as well as just some of the basic lighting that we have there. Action items, we are sharing the draft routes for EJ with the principals, contractors, and Department of Public Works. On that basis, we've set up a summit with all the public works, public safety, for the end of January, so we can debrief the beginning of transportation in the junction as well as winter transportation. We continue to plan and design work around the construction of a shelter at Educational Drive. We apparently have winter that has come here at this point.
It's too late, right?
But we'll see how persistent winter is as we get into December. Messaging to families regarding winter weather is upcoming. There's both public transport information we want to pass along, as well as our school buses. Under threats, trainees who don't pass the various stages of the CDL can become discouraged, and this is a lot of ongoing work that our bus company's doing right now, is trying to hold people on as they go through what is a pretty strenuous testing process. Again, to make $20 an hour with no benefits. So it is an active process to keep them encouraged and on board. We continue with the threat of Colchester, though that seems to be working well right now. There is a threat of trying to maintain this self-performing transportation for just 2 ADL students. So as we decided to merge with Colchester for the high school, it no longer worked with the timing for the middle school students that come from the islands. And so therefore we're just, it's a lot of effort that goes into managing employees to make sure they're available. And then you can see at the bottom the October numbers that Jamie has gotten in on route number 2 that comes through, sort of originates for our purposes at 40th and Allen and comes up to the train station, 552 trips. And for Route 4, which does the loop all the way around the town of Essex and back into the village, 1,247 trips over the course of 21 days. Jamie continues to hear that the availability of transportation outside of our normal transport hours is really appreciated at the high school level with sports, with people that don't have 1-2 blocks or people that have early release blocks. Transportation this is just a much more flexible means for them, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good story.
Okay, questions? Kaylee, Brendan, you want to find it out?
You go ahead.
Okay, I actually have 2 questions now, because the second one came up. Under threats, there's a new one, and you kind of skipped over it. Mountain
Yep.
Transit pulling existing drivers for service elsewhere.
So the
What are the
license,
circumstances?
well, and I think it's just a matter that our relationship will prevail with this, but, so we have a driver that is assigned to us that we haven't started to use, but is licensed. And as we have had that person being a bus aide, they're working at, they're not, some of the pay and differential is not really working for both the driver as well as Mountain Transit. So they've put that person onto a bus route so that they can be paid and, in theory, continue to practice. Both Jamie and I are just worried that, sometimes it's hard to get back what goes away. So we're actually meeting with Mountain Transit on Wednesday about another topic, and we'll be just reinforcing this idea that we completely understand that makes a lot of sense, but we have to understand that it expires.
I guess that ties into my second question, I guess, retaining these drivers in our system. Which would be, what happens if we get into January and we don't need the full 6 drivers? Because it seems to me like implementing Essex Junction transportation is going to have a whole lot of effects in the community, some of which you're clearly planning for well and communicating about.
Yeah.
But some of them, like, I last rode a bus in about 1994, so I have some idea how to get my kids on the bus.
Yeah.
But in the town in Westford, every year, the kindergarten families are new to it.
Yeah.
In the Junction, like, my neighbor across the street grew up in the Junction, never rode a bus.
Yep.
Like, no one on our street is gonna know anything about
Right.
how it works to ride a bus.
Right.
So if you implemented for like 1 or 2 schools and dealt with like hundreds of crazed parents who are confused, and then the next 2 weeks later you implemented for the next school, like,
Yep.
it might actually end up being okay.
Yeah. I mean, this
Imagine
is.
that, might be okay.
Might,
I'd be happier if Hiawatha was getting some transportation
yeah,
and like I got some 2 weeks later.
yeah.
Than if no one was, and then Mountain Transit gives the bus drivers to like Bolton or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we will, I think that the newer threat is this idea of assigning a bus driver in the interim, and we'll manage that through the relationship that, fortunately we built. The threat of people leaving while in training is just it's a perpetual one, and and I think that what's even more frightening is, as you know, as we've talked, is that we're moving from a model where people would become a bus driver and remain a bus driver for 10 years to a model where people are becoming a bus driver and potentially leaving within 3 months or 3 years. So we know that the churn is going to be more. So that exists, and that risk is something that I think we're all in education are trying to figure out what do we do about that, especially with the shortage. on the other part of, what would be best is purely that, we've been trying to imagine all the various ways that we could do it and then trying to imagine what the consequences were. We've heard from a number of people who don't have kids in just one school that if I'm gonna practice, my family getting onto a bus or something, there's an element of convenience and personal preference that gets expressed to us a lot with regards to, it would be that sense of, I'd rather just be able to get all my kids onto a bus if that's the way it's gonna be, rather than a little bit at a time. I think you make a good point of a little bite at a time allows us to be a little bit more concentrated in our communication and orientation. And, but we're just trying to weigh those two things. The feeling right now is all at once gets us the ability that we can communicate through Ben, through our website, through other places, and it's just one message at one time, and people aren't getting confused of, is that my school, or is, and it keeps on being that sense of, Hiawatha alone has the problem that we don't have geographical boundaries for Hiawatha that are different for Summit. Summit alone has the problem of being so proximate and having the same buses serving Fleming. So it'd be that sense of, this is your bus, but today we don't, you can get on it or can't. So all of them, and then the K5, what Jamie feels is that by doing the 4, we're actually taxing the 4 and extending our wait times more than being able to use 6 assets doing 12 runs opposed to 4 assets doing 8 runs. That we can actually serve everyone better with those 12 runs happening. But I can't tell you that we are 1,000% firm on any one of these guesses, because we don't even know what ridership's going to be like. We see ridership right now at the middle school at EMS. They've had it for ever, and it's at 35%. Will ADL come out of the gate at 70 because it's a new thing? Will it not? Anecdotally, we're hearing that our ridership's going down as the weather gets worse. It's because people don't want to walk to a stop, or the parents are willing to do that more. And so, yeah, we saw that cold day that we had before break was like some of our worst ridership at high school level. Single digits in most of the buses.
Wow.
So we're still trying to, this organism doesn't have a whole lot of like predictability to it right now until we get more history underneath us, especially in EJ.
Brendan?
Yeah, Brian, I don't understand how the second and third bullets under timeline can exist at the same time. So the second bullet says that you expect to implement transportation for village schools in January, but then the third bullet says we're going to wait until all 6 drivers are ready.
Yep.
How can both of those happen together?
Well, we have,
People.
so as of this report, we have 5 drivers that are in a 4 to 6 week point to be fully licensed and able to drive.
Yeah.
And 6 weeks from now is the beginning of January. So we would have all 6 new drivers on board at the beginning of January,
Okay.
which is when we would implement.
So if we don't have 6 drivers in January, we're not rolling out to 1 school or to 2 schools. It's kind of all or nothing.
Yeah, I think I just explained
Yeah.
why that argument makes complete sense.
Yeah.
And why there's also a challenge to each one of those logical elements.
Okay. My other question was, under action items, I see that there's a forum about, I'm assuming the viability of routes 2 and 4 that are currently being provided by GMT.
This is regional forum, so it's not isolated just in our community. So it's a
Okay.
regional forum being held that Jamie's going to be attending.
So I guess my question is that a potential threat as well, that forum could result in GMT making a decision to discontinue?
I think
routes?
that our assessment is that there is a threat to the full schedule that Route 4 does now,
Yeah.
but that our ridership potentially will be the reason to save that route on a reduced kind of window basis.
Okay.
So that, I mean, putting 1,247 trips into that is, I mean, that probably, you know, that's doubling or tripling the number of people that used to.
Yeah, I would be surprised if they ever had that kind of ridership.
Yeah. So, you know, our work, that ridership very well could save that for the commuters that are using it
Right.
in the town and in the junction.
Makes
Great,
sense.
thanks.
Okay, Liz, and then Kim.
I just wanted to remind us that the Transportation Forum in March of last year, the community said loud and clear that changes rip off the Band-Aid and make them all at once. We got that feedback from the community at that time. But to Keely's point,
I think that was about school start times.
it was about all, that was also about that, but also at the transportation when we asked how people felt about implementing some of these changes. That same, if you look back at that data, some of it does suggest that some of that because so many families have kids in multiple buildings, it is actually easier to implement it per family by doing it all at once. But to your point, if it would mean losing a driver, then hopefully the decision makers understand will obviously be factoring in. We're not going to lose a driver in order if it means we're not going to. You know what I'm saying? We're not going to make that decision to lose a driver if there are ways to get around that.
Not make decisions to lose drivers.
We could handcuff them, we would. To that point, does anything in our contract prevent Mountain Transit from taking that one that is being used someplace else just for now?
We have
Can we hold them?
the Essex Town's former contract that we are moving to expand, but we are expanding outside the thresholds of what that contract allows, which requires negotiations. And we continue to be at a point where the company is reluctant to come into a contract to provide transportation that has penalties in it. Because as they stated in 2016, trying to do this and expand is near impossible. And so the board was never able to, and prior to my coming on, to get any contract signed for the provision of expanding to Essex Junction. It's been through a concerted effort to have a relationship with this vendor to expand and theirs. So we're working on contract language right now and trying to exempt this expansion from the monetary penalties that exist in the current contract to try to bring them along. And we're not negotiating with Mountain Transit, we're negotiating with Student Transportation of America, which is the second largest school transport company in the nation. So, and this is, you know, there's a concern there.
Are we then outside of, and I'm trying to remember, I did remember we didn't have any bidders really.
There were no
We
bids.
asked for Westford to expand their coverage and Essex Town's contract to expand to include the junction there. I mean, that was an agreement that Mountain Transit would, Mountain Transit would help build the capacity to serve the junction. So it sounds like you're recalling for me that we had the agreement that they were going to expand within the existing contract, but that was more goodwill than it was anything signed from them.
So the original bid, the request for proposals that was put out in, I think, 2015, asked for a bid to provide transportation to Westford, Essex Town, and Essex Junction.
Right.
There were no bidders for the entire contract. There was a single bidder for Westford, which was the existing contractor. There were no bids for Essex Town, and there was a single bid for Essex Junction. We worked through that process coming up to August 1st, never got a signed contract before I came on board with them, and then we blinked without drivers. So That contract was never consummated, never concluded. We reverted back to Essex Town's contract for the only existing contract that we had. And we have been working on that contract to expand, and we were able to expand to 18 drivers in the contract language, so that there was no negotiations to expand to 18 drivers, but to go to the number that we want requires negotiations. And the contract right now would require it so that they would be in penalty, sort of to begin with. And so we need to rework that language, and we need to understand as a board and an administration, where do we want to go in a marketplace that doesn't want to fulfill our interests?
The junction contract that we had or didn't have, was that also Mountain Transit?
Yes.
We've never had a junction.
The bidder, you mean the bid?
The one bid
Yep.
that we had, and it,
The board awarded that to Mountain Transit, and then over the course of, from February to July, when I came in, it was never able to get a signed contract. And then
and that
by
was because they started
August.
writing that they couldn't get the drivers. That 18 buses was is that a magical number? Is that, what was the number we used to have for the
Essex Town had 15, and it was able to be increased by some percentage, with that 20%?
Okay, so that
without
got us to the-
renegotiations.
Got it, okay, I just didn't know if that number was magical. So there's no place in our contract that binds us to the existing driver that is tested, to Kaylee's point, is being borrowed, and it's our relationship
Yeah.
that
And
is
it's the
going to have that driver come
And it's
back
the
to us.
same relationship that on the 29th of August had them recruit 2 drivers out of retirement.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's, I mean, that's the element, is that we are relying more upon that recent experience and the daily experience of having a relationship with this vendor. Knowing that at least the last time we went out to public bid, that there wasn't. And I would strongly recommend that the harm to that relationship, if we wanted to charge out and bid this, may be significant. And if we weren't sure we were gonna find a replacement, we could be in a situation that is significantly worse than what we are.
And I think that was the perfect storm that was difficult 3 or 4 years ago in Essex Town. Our previous provider had recognized opportunities to be more efficient with routing.
Right.
That was all produced. We were in a contract year, went out to bid. That was awarded to Mountain Transit, and a new provider, new routes,
Yep.
different capacities was a really difficult thing. I would agree that change at this point would be ill-advised. So anyway, thank you, Brian, for the reminders.
Okay, anything else on the update? All right, so lots of finger and toe crossing left. We keep those drivers in the pipeline. Let's move on to policy discussion. This is earned as second reading on the transportation policy, which, if we are ready, will require action. Brendan, do you want to take this?
Sure. So the Transportation Subcommittee is pleased to present an updated draft of the policy that you first saw at our last meeting. We took all of the feedback that the board provided and some of the discussion that we heard, and we brought that back to the subcommittee, working with Brian and Beth and Chris Leopold, our general counsel, and we made some substantial changes to the format, to the structure, and in some parts to the language of the policy. So I'm going to sort of hit the highlights of the changes to just call attention to those, so you can have a compare and contrast compared to what you saw last time. And then I would encourage members of the subcommittee to jump in if I forget to mention something. The key changes between this version of the policy and the one that you saw at our last meeting. The first and foremost, you'll notice the format is quite different. So what we did thanks to the feedback we heard from the board, is we actually moved things that are more policy related to the front of the document and more administrative to the back of the document. So the document, in my opinion, is just much better organized and more sensible from a read start to finish. One of the new elements is the effective date, which was part of the discussion that I missed, but got caught up to speed. So at the very top of the policy, you see that the policy goes into effect on July 1st, 2019. I want to just remind folks that there are some key elements under the administrative responsibilities that hold the administration accountable for some key elements that we've talked about over the last few months especially. So we have some improvements, we think, to communication to families in the community in terms of the routes and changes to routes. So that's codified in this policy. Again, we've got something in this policy that also allows the board to review contracts over a certain dollar amount. Not a change, but just want to call your attention to that. We also have very specific reporting requirements that are baked into this policy. So the superintendent is required to provide a report on student transportation in the annual report, and then also a report to the board on the performance of the transportation system. Those would occur at least once a year. The board can always require the administration to report more than that, but this is at least the reporting once a year is baked into the policy. And then finally, I think the most challenging aspect of the new policy is this contingency plan, which is on page 2, item 6, which I believe had a slight change in wording. So you can, the members of the committee can help me out here. But one of the things that we were, as a committee, and also through counsel from Chris Leopold, is that in the event that a contingency plan is required, we recommend that the superintendent prioritize the service by grade level, while also considering the other factors that are listed on page 2. So there's a little bit of, not a lot, but there's a little bit of flexibility added, I think, to a slight change of wording as it relates to the contingency plan.
I have one item, Brendan.
Yes.
We seem to have ended up with a typo. This sometimes happens when editing in Google Docs.
Yes.
But in number 5 in the second line, here on this last page, will be annually doesn't make any sense. Was that words that we were gonna cut, or did we intend to say that it's happening annually and using some other words?
Oh, I think that probably should have been deleted. I think it should just read, bus routes for the entire district and provide them to families in August. So strike will be annually. Yep, thanks, Kaylee. And then just one final note is on page 1 under the introduction, that's the area of the policy where we really define the level of service and the populations being served and the types of transportation that are being offered. And then at the bottom of that first page that then goes on to the second page, we do sort of recognize and encourage wellness through some discussion about walking, biking, and use of public transportation. The other element that is in here is that the district, and presumably through the administration, will also advocate with the municipal town government for improved safety and travel infrastructure. So that's kind of a new twist at the bottom of page 1. Not a new twist, but it's something that I just want to make sure that people see as part of this policy. Because some of those infrastructure items are simply out of our control, such as plowing of sidewalks, improving crosswalks, those kinds of things are not necessarily things that we can control, but things that we can try to encourage through a relationship with the municipal government.
Right.
Does the committee have anything else that they want to throw in that I may have missed or want to?
No, I think you highlighted all the key points.
Okay, questions, Marla?
I have a question, and I thought of this when I was reading it, I believe it was last night when we received the final product. Because I had students that were involved with drama and music, one of the things that bothers me as a past or current parent of older kids is how this is worded under extracurricular activities transportation. And that second sentence that says, and for approved extracurricular activities, comma, such as athletic events. Are athletics the only extracurriculars that get transported? Because I can remember when my stepdaughter was at the high school, there was quite a fight about them not getting transportation to some music things, and her mother got very involved in the community. It was a real upheaval. So I just think there's a better way to word this. I think it will touch off some people that have kids in.
So you're suggesting that we either add other examples in
Or take
addition to
that out.
athletics, or take it out altogether?
I think just take it
If
out.
the band goes down for Jazz
Yeah,
Fest,
then-
and like, I know that there's a lot of
Take out the
other
example.
things that happen.
I see that as a friendly amendment.
Is that okay?
Well, how would it read?
So
Or
that would,
just takes out the-
Strike such
yeah,
as
so we would
athletic
just take
events.
out
Read,
such
the
as athletic
EWSD
events.
is also committed to providing full or partial transportation for approved field trips and for approved extracurricular activities as availability and budget constraints allow.
Mhm.
So deleting the 2 commas and what goes between them.
Got it.
That
Okay.
historical
Okay.
perspective.
I had that same concern.
Yeah.
I thought
Similar
of that
concern.
last night. I can remember
No,
Good catch.
it was.
You'll also notice in the policy that one of our largest conundrums, and that is the multiple letter issue that we used to run into. When we used to refer to ourselves as
Oh, that's true.
EWECUUSD, is that Chris Leopold asked, why are you doing that? I thought, and Keely had asked the same thing. It's like, that parentheses is your reference, and you can put anything you want in there. So we're actually going to start to just move away from that formal name.
The formal name, yeah.
Yeah, even in our financial reports and stuff.
Do we have to have it here?
No,
Can we just go with
so it gives the
EWSD?
formal name, but then we bring it
can
into
reference
For the rest
EWSD.
of it.
Yeah.
other questions or comments, Kim?
I have a few. Do we need to reference the transportation for homeless population? Maybe that's a Brian question or a Beth question.
The what, Kim?
We transport homeless
Oh.
is required, I think. I think the county shares the responsibility for educating homeless, and we may be sending a car for them, or
Yeah.
I forget exactly how
I
that
don't-
goes, and I don't know to what extent that is referenced under,
They-
would need to be or should be under non-resident students, or I don't really know.
I
Yeah.
don't think it has to be explicitly stated, because none of the other policies that we read from other districts or surrounding districts included specificity for the homeless population. I think it's
Do they all include this kind of
Can-
specificity for those who are being transported?
for like the IEP.
I think I can answer your question. The people that we're transporting under the category of resident students is students who are entitled or required to attend the schools in the district.
Right.
So insofar as homeless students are entitled or required to attend our schools,
They will be
then we'll
transported.
transport them.
As
All it says is that if they don't reside within the walking zones.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they could
Okay.
live in Texas, and if they're entitled to attend EHS, we'll be trying to transport them.
Right.
Probably more substantially, and I know you referenced Brendan, and I'd like to better understand what Chris's guidance was. Number 6, that we don't provide a required prioritization in number 4 when we are planning without a crisis for contingency. And then we, in number 6, demand a prioritization for K going upward. it feels very prescriptive. And so what was it exactly that Chris thought made that necessary?
Well, this is something that we had in our original draft, and as we talked through what the committee felt was a need to have to address the idea of contingency, we talked about a number of different variables that we could base that on, and we settled on school grade level or age, I think, and that was one of the things that Chris
Actually, our original draft did not specify anything about what should be in their procedure for developing a contingency plan, simply that they needed to make their priorities in a procedure. But when we discussed it, I guess 2 transportation meetings ago with
Right.
Chris Leopold, he thought that the key in the case of having to reduce service was trying to reach the populations that were most vulnerable.
Right.
And he acknowledged that there's one situation, which is people don't have the economic resources and live in the middle of nowhere. But the other situation, which is most common, is students are vulnerable based on being young.
Right.
Right.
And that then to the committee, I think it was Al and Patrick brought up the higher utilization.
Right.
So like it's also good planning
Right.
to continue delivering services where they're actually used, and use the processes that like currently our Hiawatha families are using to find the people who really need help, and use those systems to find the people who really need help at the high school level if we were in a situation where we couldn't deliver transportation
Right.
to everyone.
And
Yeah.
again, I think this doesn't provide for the flexibility you're talking about. We don't know yet what utilization will be in K through 4 or 5 or
Right.
8 in the
Right.
junction. So to put into policy the requirement to prioritize literally any one of these factors as a contingent plan, when we aren't requiring the same prioritization in any particular order for all of these conditions, because in a regular planning situation, we are clear to say all of these are important in no particular order and should be considered in planning. I find a contingency plan situation to be least conducive to telling the administration what they need to do.
I guess I don't understand why you need to prioritize things when you're planning like where stops go. You need to consider like who can get there, are they gonna be safe waiting at the stop together, like can they walk there on the road? But you're trying to deliver transportation to everyone.
Mhm.
So I
But if you're
don't
not
understand.
able to, you still could have situations where it might be a week and we know that there's going to be additional crossing guards for that week to get people to and from within the areas that are walkable. And and we know utilization is very low in particular areas. We are trying to prescribe a practice in a contingent situation that should offer the most flexibility for how they address it. And I think when we look at not telling them how to do their job in planning for stops or otherwise in no particular order, and then when we tell them in a crisis situation, here's how you have to do it, I think it's well outside our bounds, one, to do it. I think it's not reasonable not to leave them as many options as available. And I also don't understand whether administrative responsibilities are policy or procedure. Are we voting on the part that is nowhere,
That is policy.
like the intro part, and administrative responsibilities or procedures? I'm very unclear how that goes, but I really do take exception to us telling them what to do in a contingency situation when we've said these factors are important.
And I think the way we tried to address that, Kim, is that we did alter the language in 6 to add the phrase "and in consideration of the factors above." So while we ask them in developing a contingency plan to prioritize by grade level, it's not restricting all of the options on the table. It's just asking them to look at that element first as they develop the plan. but it doesn't say that the plan must be based on grade level.
It says it needs to be
says
developed.
will.
In consideration of the other factors.
But I don't, those two things seem in conflict with one another. But you must prioritize this. It needs to be developed, prioritizing that, and consider the other factors. So it can't be that age isn't the driver in the way that's worded. And I also just don't understand if this is procedure or policy.
Patrick?
So I guess, Kim, I'm confused. You're looking at 4, where this is just establishing routes and stops. Yes, but what we're saying is that when there are not enough drivers, how do we decide who gets those drivers? This is not,
It's not a board decision.
yeah, well, our administration has asked us repeatedly to provide them specific guidance, and we have not done so. This is in response to a direct ask from administration. So we can either, between administration and the board, continue to throw this ball back and forth saying, administration is looking for guidance. We need to have some direction that the board wants us to follow. And then the board has been saying for the past year, it's not our decision. We don't want to prescribe too much to you. I'm sorry, but there needs to be a final decision somewhere, and this is where this final decision is. You can say that we don't want to prescript them. Administration is telling us we need prescription, we need identification, we need a specific prioritization, and that's what they are explicitly telling us.
Can I just speak on behalf of the administration?
Sure.
I think there's a need to have clarity of the will of the board.
Right.
So there hasn't been clarity of the will of the board. There's been opinions, and so the administration is asked to have clarity of the whole will of the board. So in this case, there could be that sense of, if it's administration's, and administration does it, but if there is that sense, and I said this at the policy committee before, is let's make sure we develop a policy that would have us being in a different place than where we find ourselves today. And that is in disagreement with administration's decisions. So it's either either going to the side and having the will of the board be, we're going to leave that to administration, and those are not decisions we're going to be evaluating and opining on, or we're going to provide the guidance that we need to ensure greater boundaries around getting the decisions that we want.
Right.
So that, and I can live with either of those, but the in-between has been the difficulty.
Yeah,
Right, so I've got Diane
Okay.
next.
I just had one.
I agree with Patrick's statements. And I addressed the fact that it says to develop procedures. It's requesting the administration to develop the contingency plan, the procedures of how this is gonna be operating. It doesn't say that they're going to absolutely do those, but if you're going to have a contingency plan, gotta go somewhere. And I agree with Brian that they have requested feedback and not opinion. There's been a lot of opinions. I've expressed my opinion. I think this paragraph addresses the concerns that the board has expressed well. And I think it gives the direction the administration has requested. They can flesh it out as they want.
All set?
Yeah, so.
I just had a couple of comments. When I reread this, thought about it over the night, we sort of taken extracurricular activities off the table with the initial statement. But really, everything is on the table when you have to make hard decisions. And I'm not so sure, first of all, extracurricular should be completely off the table, but if push comes to shove and we really got into a deep problem, we may have to. That's a hard choice, but it's something that the administration could consider. I just don't want to see, you can't touch this, you can't touch that. Everything is on the table at that point. Second point I'd like to make is I really would appreciate not reading in the Essex Reporter a whole new major changes in our transportation system. If it's going to affect, if the change is going to affect a lot of students, I think the board needs to be involved up front. And I know there are going to be hard decisions, but I think the board can help in making those decisions along with you.
We didn't show ourselves to be very capable of that this year.
But I know,
So,
but I don't appreciate that.
Kim,
I wanted to speak to, Kim, your concern about whether the administrative responsibilities here belong in policy or procedure. I think the policy as it currently stands is modeled very closely over policy C10, which is the bullying and harassment policy, in which section 2 implementation includes a similar list of administrative responsibilities, beginning with adopt a procedure to do X, Y, and Z. So what we were trying to do here was not write procedure ourselves, but outline to the administration their responsibilities in implementing the policy. And one of those responsibilities is to have a procedure so that anyone in the community who wants to know, if we don't attain our full 25 drivers, what should I expect for, you know, which of my children are going to be at risk of needing me to drive them? They will be able to make some sort of prediction, or at least we on the board would be able to make some sort of prediction about the result of threats. And there's a lot of possible vectors that the administration still has completely under their control. Like, I know Martha is concerned that there's kids who are in kindergarten but could walk. And it's like we're trying to capture those kids using walking zones, which are not applied at all in communities that don't have sidewalks. Like, nobody in Westford is walking to school, even if they live within half a mile of the school. So we are acknowledging all of those things in the things that are higher priority, establishing the walking zones, establishing who is an eligible rider, and establishing where the routes and stops will be. So just among the people who fall into the category of eligible riders, what happens when we can't serve enough people? And I think that this assessment is a reasonable approach to guiding the administration as they develop those procedures.
Yeah, and I just want to also, Keely, that's a good point. I think the other thing I just want to raise as far as the administrative responsibilities go, I don't see these really as procedures, but rather expectations regarding oversight. So one of the things that I think we've all heard is that, you know, how can the board be more on top of the systems and the situations that we experienced this past year? And so we now require more communication. We require, you know, the review of contracts. We require, you know, annual reports about the health of the system. So we're trying to provide more oversight and communication through the policy, not necessarily how those things occur. I see them differently than procedures.
so as I wrote to you, I still have concerns about number 6 because of how things work in Westford. If you say it has to be prioritized by age, and I believe that is what this says. Suppose we only have enough drivers to transport K-5. Does that mean in Westford that the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders can't get on the bus that's going right by their house?
Yes.
Yes.
So
this doesn't make any
has
sense.
room for them. I just think this isn't workable in our district.
I only got to respond to you a couple hours ago, but I think that if we are looking at efficient bus routing, putting students from Founders and Essex Middle on the same bus is something that the administration will certainly consider at some point. And then we would have the exact same issue in Essex Town. We have a situation right now where Westford buses can only be used in Westford. And in an ideal situation, all the buses from our entire contract would be able to be used in whatever circumstances our administration decides they should be used. And then you probably wouldn't have a situation where a bus is being used in a way where it's not full and that somehow helps our transportation system. So we could be extending the number of routes each bus runs in order to bridge that gap where it seems like we don't have quite enough buses for 5 or 6 through 8 through the whole district. We could be having rolling outages where some weeks 5 through 8 gets it in Westward and some weeks it gets it in the town, and some weeks those 15 people who ride for Lawton get it, which is a common practice in surrounding districts to do rolling outages.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of ways that the administration could deal with a situation where one level set of students has some but not enough buses to serve it.
How does it make any sense to have a policy that would deprive 5th or 8th graders in Westford of transportation when the bus is going by their house and isn't full? I can't make it make sense to me. There's no way that those buses are be going to Essex Town to pick up. I mean, it would just take way too long.
Okay, I want to remind you, I got chastised by you a few meetings ago because I brought up my district. And I'm hearing you talk about your district. We are one district, and the policy needs to work for the total district. I don't see where this is gonna stop buses going by. The reality is in Westford, you're probably not gonna find one bus company ever signing a contract to do us totally. So that contracted company for Westford would not be moving over to Town of Essex or Essex Junction. And I think you're a reminder that we were one district, and we are.
And I agree
So-
with that. I am pointing out the fact that this particular provision may make for a very inefficient and not sensible transportation system. It just happens to be that it's my community where it doesn't work, but it's not that I'm advocating for Westford in any way. I'm pointing out why I don't think number 6 is workable. Patrick?
I think that there are some suppositions here that we're making when Marla is correct in that we need to create a policy that works for every town within the district. I mean, right now, I am certain that there are buses that are not full that are going through Essex Town that theoretically could be utilized because there's not enough space to go and pick up maybe some EJ residents along the way because they're out on Susie Wilson Road and the bus goes right past and EJ students are 50 yards away and maybe they need to get to Hiawatha and the bus isn't full, so why can't they use those? But we're not doing that now. I mean, the policy itself is targeting those who will use the buses most. I know Kim had mentioned that we don't know what that's going to look like for EJ, but we do know that historically, both in district and also throughout the country, that the youngest students by far use bus services in significant percentage amounts. We need to target the individuals that are going to be using these bus services. And for an instance like Westford, I mean, what if, I know, and again, once we start going down the path of what if, I think we start running across a lot of bigger issues. What if the company that handles Westford right now folded up tomorrow? Like, I mean, what would we do? I mean, we need to be able to, in contingency plans, realize that, okay, with what bus services we have, we need to look at Westford and realize that there are kindergartners, first graders, second graders, third graders who probably use the bus more often than anyone else. If we need to divert some other, resources, as it were, out to get those kids, then that's what we have to do. And yes, it does in some instances mean that there may be some inefficiencies like the ones you're talking about, but I think that we're never going to get a policy that's going to be 100% efficient. I think that what we're doing with this policy and with a prioritization like this is we are targeting the students who will use it most. That will work uniformly through all the towns and the districts. And there are always going to be examples of, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens, or what have you. It's just that this is the most universally efficient, fair, and I would argue equitable.
The reason why we can't do that is because we can't prescribe for what if. I think what we could do is ask that annually the procedures in case of contingency planning be shared with the board at the same time the annual report happens. That would mean we have a policy that asks that we have anticipated contingency planning when we know what the ridership had been the previous year, when we have a policy that is effective at a time where we have full implementation of services and we know how it's being utilized, when we know if a route is getting 10 people on it and they can make decisions about how to best deploy vans and drivers and fingerprinted people to get people to school. This does not allow for that. So I would recommend an amendment that leaves the second sentence off and says procedures will be brought before the board annually for anticipated contingency plans. I think that that allows the discussion at the time. It demands what we did not do last time around, which was come to us explaining the rationale for the contingency plan you made. So like with a week before school starting, the high school kids not having rides, bring that to us and help me understand how that's equitable given the age of kids, the kids on the hinterlands of Essex, the kids in the hinterlands of Westford, and the kids up in Grand Isle. Tell me, defend that to us. So instead of doing it reactively, if we were to reword that, saying these procedures as part of the annual reporting are come before the board, but they're informed by utilization in the previous year or whatever data tool administration, because they're charged with and experts in this, not board members, that would be part of what they're required to report to us. That's us monitoring. That is our job. Writing procedures for administration on transportation or anything else is not our job. I feel very strongly on that. And that's why we can't make this work for everybody, because we're trying to make it work and we're the board, not the administration with data. That's my suggestion.
Brendan.
So, I haven't taken a vote, but I get a sense that we're at an impasse on this particular point. So what I would propose is a recognition that even the requirement that the administration develop a contingency plan, it's a brand new concept. We didn't have that in our previous policy, and we didn't really see that in much of the policies that we examined. So to me, that's a big step forward, but it's also a reflection of the experience that we've just had and the time that we're in, where there's a huge amount of distrust between the board and the administration on this issue. I think we need to recognize that. So my suggestion to move the conversation forward and to move this policy forward is that we drop the grade level requirement from number 6, but we maintain the contingency provision so that the administration has to develop a contingency plan and present it to the board on an annual basis or whatever the frequency is, because that is clearly not something that that's not an argument that we're gonna be able to resolve tonight, but I still feel like we're making a step forward by requiring a contingency.
So just take out that second sentence of 6, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but maybe have something that describes how how the contingency plan is presented to the board. But
Well,
that
the
would be my
contin-
suggestion.
I think that this was developed, that the contingency planning was not an exercise, it was based upon an event.
Right.
Like it, so I don't know, maybe this is clarification that's really important, is the idea for, that we would have an event and come up with a published contingency plan, rather than imagining a series of possible events and then imagining a series of.
Right, right.
So it's, because there's a whole lot of room that happens with, I mean, it's within the discretion of administration to change walking zones.
Yeah.
Right.
It's within the discretion to run the number of routes.
Right.
We could be running 3 rather than 2.
Right.
So there's a whole series to continue to do the intended level of service, because nowhere in the policy is a 20-minute ride, or picked up
Right.
within 15 minutes of this, or, so there's a lot of that element in there, but I just want to make sure that we don't go through an exercise, because it would be exhaustive to think of every
All the
potential
yeah.
what if, and then a response to it. And I just want to remind, we have, and I think this continues to get lost in just how we feel about it, but coming into August, when we didn't have enough drivers, the contingency plan was prioritize historically served. Secondly, out of that population, prioritize by grade level. That was, and so that was the contingency plan.
Right, right.
There hasn't been any universal agreement of the board that that was okay. So now I think what I've asked for is, if that wasn't okay, and we spend months and every other week having updates and hours of time at meetings, then let's get it the way the board wants it. And I think what the committee is saying is that the board wants it by grade level, not historically served.
I don't
And
think that that's the case at all. As a matter of fact, I've commented on this.
Members of the board that think that. I'm not sure if it's universal. And my concern is, how practical is it? And without knowing what the ridership is, what the possibilities are, it just feels like this is tying the administration's hands in a way that we could regret. Yes.
So I, before Brendan spoke, was interested in if there was a different way that we could edit this sentence, which might solve your concern or might not, Martha, which is that currently it does seem to suggest by grade level very specifically, when I think what we were trying to express was by like things like elementary level, middle level, upper level, like how teachers are certified. So the goal is that first you transport all of the youngest students, and then you transport all the middle level students, and then you transport the high school students. So we're not saying you have to transport all the 6th graders before you can move on to any 7th graders, but that you're trying to work something out for all of those 5th through 8th graders at one time. So if there were a way that we could express that it's by groups, because I don't think that anyone in this room would want to have a situation where we are sacrificing transporting Westford K through 8
Right.
in order to transport all of the high school students across the district. Like, that just doesn't make sense in the context of the priorities of this board, the advice of our legal counsel, or best practices. Like, so try and get it that it's larger swaths that we're trying to achieve, you know, some sort of baseline level of acceptable transportation before we bite off the next older chunk.
So I wonder if there's some way to express it as by schools. I don't know that I'm articulating very well my concern about Westford, but if you're having a bus drive a route in Westford and only pick up K through 5 students, it just doesn't make any sense, because there's room on the bus. That bus isn't going to go to Essex Town or Essex Junction. So it's not about getting Westford School 8th graders to school and the 8th graders in Essex Town might not be. It's just about the fact that it's practically stupid not to pick up every kid on the road in a place like West.
Well, we have 5 buses that do K8 that serve the town right now.
Right.
So there's 5 routes. And just like Westford, if you were going to eliminate a population, there is a chance that you could go from 4 routes to 3 routes to then maximize your ridership per bus. And it might mean that the routes become, an hour and 10 minutes long. But that would be the concept, is that you would reduce down the amount of buses that you would need for that ridership, and then you would be able to free up an asset to be somewhere else serving the district. So it wouldn't be that you would just prevent it. The same thing that would happen with the K8 buses that we run. If you didn't have it, you would actually change the routes so that you freed up assets. Almost like what we did by freeing up an asset that was serving the islands, we were able to incorporate that into our fleet. So at some point, you can't do Westford, you can't do Westford with a bus. So there's some point where it just doesn't collapse any further.
Right.
And therefore you would need to start to look at, contingencies of contingencies. But, that would be the idea, is that if you were serving less people, you would change your routes, maybe expand some of your travel time, and go. And there are districts that, they expand and lengthen routes, which doesn't attract any more ridership, which doesn't demand any more assets, but it provides transportation. And,
Yeah.
so there's,
And it's a tool, unencumbered by, sorry, it's a tool unencumbered by picking one of the things that may not be in your toolbox if we're telling you what you have to do. And so I guess, while I appreciate, Brian, I would not want you to run every iteration that you could envision, but rather that you would develop a procedure that's informed by current data regarding ridership, current length of routes, and supporting, making certain kids get to school. I think the piece that we do sort of have domain over is funding for transportation, and questioning you, as we should, on how transportation is being utilized and the expense of the benefit that we're providing. So when you come before us in budget time and we hear about the cost of transportation, it's helpful to know how many buses we're running and the utilization of those buses, just in a not now mode, in a 2 years from now mode, in a next year mode, in a this fall mode, that we understand the investment we're making and the people being served by it, and that we understand when you're envisioning, this is why I kind of think it could come in the fall once we've no October ridership, that when you give us a transportation update before we hit budget again, you would say, based on the current ridership of this year, if we needed to reduce, we would need to make routes longer, or
Yep.
this car's going way out there and we're gonna send a car for us.
Yep.
Like, then I think you could say, if we lose people, but equally as importantly is having a contract unrestricted by town boundaries. So I
Yeah.
appreciate, right now we have Westford Transportation and we have Mountain Transit, and if even jointly we could look at how, and we've got Mountain Transit with a Colchester bus or something, how we prevent those boundaries from inhibiting our utilization of
Yep.
resources that ultimately happen because of goodwill would be something I think we as a board, as we look at contract, have domain over, saying, that's a priority, please figure that out.
Right.
Help it, and honestly, start and stop times are not finite right now. We know to expect change.
Right.
When you guys do that, I expect, again in our domain, that we hear the impact on cost to transportation, because we don't want to drive student ability to be awake at school by the cost of transportation, but we can't ignore it. It's not within our ability to say we don't care how much it costs. Do it anyway because it's the right thing for kids.
Yeah.
Those are all things in our domain. Telling you how to manipulate resources if they become constrained is not our domain. And it doesn't for you to use assets.
as efficiently and effectively for all kids.
Brendan?
So I missed the part of the meeting where you all discussed the effective date of July 1st, 2019, but my understanding was that that was to allow time for the district to actually fully implement a district-wide student transportation system, which I think is wise. So very soon, by the end of this school year, we will no longer have historically served,
Right.
because everyone will
Yeah.
be served.
That's right.
So I guess I want to go back to my original proposal because I think that right now we are we're prisoners of our own circumstance in this moment, and to move this policy forward, because this is gumming up the works at the moment, I propose that we eliminate the grade level language out of item 6, but still require the development of a contingency plan based on whatever threats or reduction in service that we anticipate, and require that of the administration. But I think that's the only way we're going to move this policy forward. I personally would feel that we would still be taking a step forward. I'm not speaking for the committee at this point. So I would just propose that is something that we consider as a board, an amendment to the draft that's currently before us.
Kim?
Just to respond to that, based on what Brian has said in this meeting and before, I think if we're adjusting the language in number 6, we need to be clear on the language of what we mean by procedures, identifying how services will be reduced, and by contingency plan. Because it sounds like Brian is looking at a contingency plan as a response to specific circumstances. And I think what we were looking at originally here is procedures that talk about making explicit what tools the administration would use to respond to a hypothetical situation, not a specific situation. So saying, these are the possible ways that we will reduce service, and we will prioritize these things. So like, we'll prioritize keeping rides under 2 hours, or we'll prioritize transporting the youngest children, or we'll prioritize, running over bicyclists. I don't know, but like, just laying out those things, and like, these are the tools we'll use. We'll use drivers who have been fingerprinted. We'll use.
Yeah, I think it's
whatever.
like it's almost like the levers are there's a tier 1 lever, which is, we've talked some about, it could be tweaking a walking zone, it could be tweaking the number of runs, it could be tweaking routes or times, and so some of those, I mean, those are infinite. But that's sort of a place to make sure that we're maintaining. I think as we go, we understand what tier 2 is where we just can't tweak anymore, and that we're sort of left with the hit bicyclists, and we want some other option, and that might be that sense of employ a van route for farther out, or it might be that sense of, I mean, as Brendan said, I think the key part is there was serious issue with serving historically served. That was the whole thing. We'll get to a point where historically served will be 100% of our schools, and then we already know exactly what we did. Once we did historically served and we still didn't have enough, we went by grade level and we eliminated all the high school.
Right.
We didn't go like, okay, we're going to take seniors out, we're going to take juniors out. We know that these grade clusters make the most sense because the school can support that rather than supporting 25% of 100. So
Kim said something earlier that might make sense. Should we see a contingencies plan in the spring so that, we know our biggest threat is drivers, right? So who, in the spring, we would.
You can't determine that in the
can't do-
spring.
No.
You
Well,
can't
you couldn't.
determine the contingencies in the fall.
How do you prescribe a disaster? How can you prescribe a disaster? You can do flood planning, okay, but a lot of places here in Vermont discovered that they were not prepared because they didn't think the little itty bitty creek was gonna wipe them out when Irene came.
Could I,
So-
could I finish?
Please
Because
do.
I wasn't finished. So what I'm thinking is that by the end of this year, we should know our ridership, right? For the whole district, assuming everybody gets a bus. Which, if they don't, then we can have a 10-day retreat next summer.
With which we get CDLs.
So I am thinking by the spring, we should be able to figure out what are the most efficient routes that can be designed. And then we should be able to say, if we don't have drivers for all those routes, this is what we do. Or we can reduce the number of drivers we need by having bus routes that are an hour and a half long. I still think it's the administration's job to do that, not ours. Patrick?
I agree.
I guess I fundamentally disagree. That I don't believe that, given that the administration has asked for guidance, that we continue to set ourselves up for these contingency plans that come up and that meet public outcry and that half of the board isn't happy with. You're saying in the spring we'll come up with a contingency plan. That's what happened in August. We got a contingency plan, and then 2 days later, the plan fell apart because it was way less. This here, prioritization by grade level, works with every town across the district. There may be some inefficiencies, yes, but we need to have some language in here that isn't setting ourselves up for the same failure that we experienced in August. And Kim, to your point about the budgetary and what we control with that, money is not a problem here. Money has not been a problem. We have more than enough money.
So let's pretend we're not in crisis and we're all served, Patrick, because it was an issue when we had a transportation crisis 3 or 4 years ago. We had reduced routes. We needed to say, add a bus. And then they couldn't get bus drivers, and they're trying to get them from New Hampshire. Believe me, I understand that. But the reason that that was important was that we really had the responsibility for having reduced the budget for transportation based on information we had that didn't play out. And to be able to do what we needed to do in acceptable terms for families and within the limits of capacities on the buses, we had to say, yes, add a bus. So I guess I'm just trying to keep us, if we were all fully served right now, all the things Brian described would potentially be off the table, because the very first thing we have to do is prioritize K through whatever versus making everybody's ride a little bit longer so that everybody can get to school. And we didn't even say time on the bus as an option up ahead. We are, what I'm begging us to do is give them license and hold them accountable to providing us data on which they made their decisions, and that we can have a discussion about it and say, just prove to us that makes sense. We don't know that yet. Whether it's the spring, I don't think we need to prescribe the time. Maybe it's twice a year. In the spring, based on what we saw for the last year, what do you think? And October again, we want to know what you think based on this. So what I know Brian was asking for was because we were basically saying, this is what you told us you were doing, and half of us were saying, that's a stupid idea. That's not fair. It's an administrative decision, and we need to provide them as much leeway to make good decisions in difficult times as possible.
There's a lot of leeway in here, a significant amount of
There's not when you say
leeway.
you prioritize K through whatever. It
In
is
a lack
not.
of drivers being a resource, not money, then I believe that there is a significant amount of not only leeway, but equity. What we have now is frankly completely unacceptable to me, and was unacceptable back in August. And it's very convenient that the historically served representatives of this board are arguing that we not put this in here.
I have experienced for years the idea that the K-8 was paying for our high school kids because it was important to get them to school. And it wasn't a consideration when we didn't have enough capacity that we were going to cut out the high school kids, even though we were paying Union High School taxes and K-8 taxes that were covering the 9-12 transportation because it was a priority. We didn't say that. We said, please figure out how we're getting more buses, because we need them. And all I want is us to keep sentence 1 and demand that they come to us with their plans, not for every single contingency, but what are your procedures if the resources aren't enough? We have to presume that we are fully served. If we get to the spring and we're not fully served, we have to that contingency plan would come real. We would have to have a conversation then. I hope we don't get to February without everybody being
But all we
served.
do is kick that down the road at this point.
Not
We
our job,
have the
Patrick.
contingency.
We have to stay within our responsibilities, and it is not the role or responsibility of the board to set priorities when the administration has to make a plan if we don't have the resources. I want them to consider every possible option for every kid in our district.
Exactly.
And I want them to defend how they arrive at their
I think
decision.
it's true.
And when we
Could-
disagree with it, as we did earlier, and the board is split, then at least
Again,
here.
it's not an administrative decision. We need to have, it's not a board decision. We would want to hear the rationale, and in theory, we wouldn't be able, if they didn't feel comfortable that we could support with consensus their decision, they would probably make a different decision. But we could express that opinion and still invite them to use every available resource and all data they have to figure out how to best serve every kid.
Could I,
So I've got Brendan and Keely.
I'll yield to Keely for a second.
I have a suggestion about how we might be able to reduce the specificity of criteria while getting to some of Patrick's concern in this first sentence. What if we said, develop procedures identifying how services will be reduced either uniformly or equitably across the district if resources are insufficient? Then the administration would have to prove that their criteria were equitable, or they would have to apply criteria uniformly across the district.
then we
And
could
still
add-
get rid of
Which
the second sentence?
Presumably, we're gonna prioritize the youngest children.
Well, and if I
But-
could just piggyback on what Keely's saying, since we seem to be maybe moving toward a resolution on this. If we eliminate the second sentence, we could replace it with, these procedures will be presented to the board, informed by data utilized to establish the procedures. Could be the
Will
second
be
sentence.
presented to the board, informed by data, utilized to inform procedures.
Mhm.
Say that again.
I'm not sure about the phrasing on that.
Well, it would have to go through the Keely filter, but, so develop, so it would have, the first sentence as Keely described it, but then there would have to be, maybe the second sentence could say that the procedures will be presented to the board so that we could, I guess, evaluate them, but they would have to be data informed, you know? So the administration would have to present those procedures to the board. I've lost it.
So it would be develop procedures identifying how services will be reduced uniformly or equitably if resources are
I would say uniformly or equitably, one of those two words,
or
across the entire district.
Right.
Can we send this
Okay.
back to committee?
No.
I'm not comfortable voting on this tonight with changing as much language as we are. I'd like
We're
it to
talking
go-
about one provision.
No, I'd
in
like
one
it to go
sentence.
back to the committee and administration and be involved. To me, it's a lot of change.
What do others think?
I want to get it done.
I
think we're close.
I would love to hear what Chris Leopold says about changes to this one, since the
Level was
age
his
was.
legal recommendation.
You need
Yeah.
the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
But,
going to committee and hearing from Chris Leopold is just gonna be the same people hearing from Chris Leopold.
Exactly what he told us before,
Yeah.
which is that grade level was his recommendation as legal counsel. I mean, at some point, the residents of one of these towns is gonna sue us as a district for the taxes that we're putting into a system that we're not getting anything out. I mean, it will
That's
happen.
not, that is, There's no tax variation based upon your number of students,
No.
number of riders, and if you have no students in the school, you pay the same tax rate. That is a misnomer that continues and has to stop, because it threatens the very passage of a school budget if people feel like they are only gonna get a physical service from paying property taxes to support education.
Yeah.
It has to. Because we do not surcharge, if I have 3 kids riding the bus, I don't pay 4 cents more in my tax rate.
Right.
And then when all my kids graduate, I don't get a 10-cent rebate.
Right.
So it just, and none of us want to make sure that we have all the services prevailed to us that we provide. We don't want our kids to be in reading intervention just because our tax rates are paying for it. So, you know, I think there is a reasonable idea that it is the intent of this board, it has been a public commitment to provide transportation to all, and once all are provided, they become historically served, and we have a past practice of going by grade level once we don't, when we're pushed up against the thing. I mean, there's some wisdom to that. The board has talked about it. I think no matter what side of the argument you're on, you can agree that, you know, if it's 14% ridership versus 55% ridership, if it's 18 years of age versus 8 years of age, I mean, a lot of this works. It's what your administration put into effect. It's the historically served that continues to be our vexing moment. And I'd love to think of a future not too far away when we are all historically served.
But if I may, not, and with complete and total respect and the understanding of trying to unify us rather than divide us, part of the very significant guidance that I received when I first became a board member was explicitly making sure that we had a good return on investment for taxpayer money for the community that sent us here. And I completely agree that public education and public schools and the taxes that everybody pays as part of their property tax goes towards a societal good. I completely agree with that as well. But there is I'm speaking very, very roughly here, but very roughly, you know, this is not an insignificant amount of the budget. You know, it's not like we're talking about, you know, this is a $5,000 service for someone who needs additional reading. It's that Essex Junction taxpayers are really, we're all contributing to the same budget, but there's 2 whatever million going into it. $1 million of that is being served to make sure that the Essex Towns kids get to school. 500,000 of that is making sure Westford kids get to school, and none of that is making sure that Essex Junction kids get to school. So I completely respect the unification part of it, and if this was a matter of, you know, $5,000, $10,000, I wouldn't really be batting an eye. But this is, I feel very strongly as part of my responsibility towards the voters who put me here, and the literal word-by-word guidance that I received on making sure that my taxpayers are getting a good return on their investment, that a huge chunk of the budget, a huge percentage of what's getting paid for by that taxpayer money is just not getting served. And this language ensures that every town in the district is getting a good return on their investment for transportation money. And I realize that there are no perfect solutions, but I believe that this was the most fair. It's not going to cut out individuals from Westford, you know, kindergartners. If they're getting picked up in EJ and they're getting picked up in a town, they're going to get picked up in Westford. And if that's happening for first graders and second graders, and we go up like that, and we work on those students who by far need it the most, which we do already have existing data for, it's telling us that if you're in kindergarten or first grade, that more than 50% of them are using bus services, that this language covers equitability across the district, and it covers my responsibility as an individual sent here by taxpayers to make sure that my citizens get a good return on their investment.
I could say a lot. I'll shut up, Kim.
The kids are our responsibility, and we are looking to serve all of them most efficiently and effectively for all of our taxpayers. the tax rates were about the same in the Junction and the town K8 in the last several years, and transportation was provided in the town and not provided in the Junction. From what I understand, there was a ballot resolution item put before the community as Essex Junction that went down profoundly. I don't think that's a productive conversation at all, but I appreciate the equitable issue. You don't design policy, and that's why it's effective July 1 in this narrow vision. I think as it is, we're prescribing, we're saying that there has to be procedure. We're sort of in a space that bullying, hazing, and harassment has implementation required, because those are law. I mean, they're very driven by law. We had in our old policy what was required by law in transportation. So we are definitely, I tried to look to see if I could find a common format for our required policies, and I really couldn't find one, even though we had used lots of model policy. They're not common. So I can live with it being administrative responsibility and being under our policy umbrella, totally. But this number 6, I really appreciated the suggestion, Keely, that if we were looking at this 2 years from now or a year from now, which is what you do policy for, like it's sustainable beyond those of us sitting here at this table and your beliefs on your job, Patrick, and all of us understanding our roles in the way that we interpret them. So if we were to add, develop procedures identifying how services will be reduced equitably if resources are insufficient to provide the intended level of transportation services. I left out the parenthetical, but it'd stay there, so you stick equitable in there.
I didn't say equitably, I said equitably across the entire district.
So that's fine.
That's what I'm trying to express is,
So I would take
if we're
that to
not
mean,
transporting kindergartners for some reason.
right, but so
After
my
all
second
of them.
sentence I think is equally important, because what we're telling them is come to us with your procedures. And then these procedures will be presented to the board, informed by data utilized to establish the procedures. Like, tell us what you're using, because what if we find out that what's really happening is kids in the village that have been used to walking their entire lives, if they live in a mile's distance from school, they're still walking because their family always did that, and they're still doing it. Every year, if we require them to look at utilization data and experience, we really don't know, like, what people are going to find. I will say that, like, when the ride gets too long, in the town where they've had buses forever, because the routes are so long, people drive their kids. It might be inconvenient. They might be going the wrong direction to work, but they may decide to do that. We don't know yet what's going to happen in the village. So to say that that answer has to be by age if there's a contingency plan, but to ask for them to come to us with their thinking based on data, maybe in the spring and in the fall after ridership settles again, Brian knows, like, even if we weren't trying to do what we were trying to do and we didn't have a disaster last year, it doesn't settle till like October to know who's going to ride buses and not ride buses and what's going on, even in historically served communities. So I think it's really reasonable to ask that they share with us the data they would use to inform decisions if the resources weren't there, and that we demand that they be equitably applied throughout the district based on that data. And I think that equitable is not necessarily the same. And you could defend for us why, we're finding that this bus that goes in this loop is not getting anybody on it, whether it's in any domain, any place in the district.
Equitable is I would just suggest that it adds another sophistication and a complexity to this that really has to understand the individual situations, because equitable is all about the inputs that are required to get the same outcome. So in those cases, we may have people that ride regularly, but it is difficult for us to determine whether they would have another means to do so. While there are other people that are on a bus that we have a very difficult time determining whether they would, so uniformly or across the entire district has a little bit more of a binary kind of relationship to it. We don't need to understand the 590 different circumstances or 4,000 circumstances. I mean, you might be able to speak to, just the idea of that, like, equitable versus, in this role, we would need to almost have an interview process to understand.
Right.
I think what we're looking for is, like, one kindergartner I mean, we just talked about proficiencies, right? We should have the same proficiencies across all kindergarten, across all first grade, right? There's just some of that logic as one district without boundaries. So that's kind of more uniformity or aligned. Equity it's being used a lot, and it's great, but, you know, equity is not about having the same outcomes.
Right.
Right. And
I guess that's where the part where it's informed by data would tell me that.
Yeah.
So like.
But
I
the
would
11
imagine-
kids on that bus that is
Might not have any
woefully
other choice.
underutilized might be the precise 11 kids that need that assistance to get to school and access their
Right.
education.
Right.
equity doesn't mean the same all the time.
Well,
Yeah.
Equal and equitable are different.
Right.
And we still
Concepts.
develop, our system that we're still talking about, our intended level of transportation service is still that sense of that 100% of our students have the opportunity, you know, if you're outside the walking zone, but it still is that, it is the 100% element.
Right.
So that we're going by every
So
potential
uniformly-
student's door.
I guess I was again wondering, like, uniformly, what if we find out just by ridership? That again, that like the walking, I forget what our distances are for littler kids and bigger kids and otherwise, but like families have always walked a mile or whatever it is. We don't know that yet. And so if uniformly were the thing and we were to say, if that meant that you couldn't expand the walking distance where the data lends itself to that, but like, so maybe we would try and expand the walking distance for all the schools because we find out that's the case that it would work. We know it doesn't work in Westford. We know we'd get outside of boundaries with sidewalks in Essex pretty quickly. But understanding that just as long as how you would interpret
Yeah.
that takes into account maybe uniformly along with the other road I don't even know, but like I think that's fine if uniformly provides more information to you, but then you're able to provide the data that helps explain the decision you made.
Yep.
I think that's where our role is, to really ask you to defend the decision and provide data.
So
So-
this has gone on far longer than it should. Brendan, would you be willing to have your committee meet one more time and try to hash this out, given where we've gotten to tonight?
I'm willing to give it another try. Based on the conversation tonight, I have a very hard time. I guess what I want to set up is the possibility that we may not come to a resolution within the committee
Right.
about what to bring forward. So I just want to at least get you thinking about what if that happens.
Okay. I will do that. Not to prolong this discussion, and since Chris has looked at this, it's probably fine. But way back in the very first paragraph, it says the school district will furnish transportation to and from school. And then in the second sentence, it says we're not required to do it. So I'm just curious why we use the word will. Should it be may?
Do you want me to speak to
You
those
can
series
go
of
for it if you
sentences?
like.
So the language in the model policy began with huge alphabet soup districts may furnish transportation to and from school. Therefore, we have decided to furnish transportation to and from school. And then we went on in another paragraph to talk about how transportation was a privilege that was not required or mandated. So it was kind of not very clear for a human to read, and we tried to compress it into something that would express the idea that we intended to provide transportation, which is a privilege, and that comes up again later when discussing student behavior.
I guess the former legislator in me says, when you say will, somebody can sue you. And that's my question.
We were trying to avoid shall because
Right.
it's only for lawyers.
Could you say it is our intention to? I'll
It is
let
the
you-
intention of the school district to furnish.
Right.
But I think, isn't that covered in the first part, like read as a whole, where it is reasonable and necessary to enable? Then we will furnish transportation, like where it's reasonable, where it's necessary, we'll do it. But it's not a, it
I guess
is not
it's-
a specific.
It becomes unreasonable when we have
Requirement.
0 drivers or 0 budget.
Yeah, I mean, I get what Martha's saying. I'm just wondering if as a whole, with the sentence itself, because we included that at the beginning,
Right, does that make,
does that make?
does the whole sentence make sense? Because
I
it has that
think
beginning
so.
part?
Martha, does shall fix it? Because I don't know legislator language.
No, shall is worse.
Okay. May?
Well, I had suggested may.
We'll take
It
that under
just seems
advisement.
like with
Yeah.
May,
Why don't you talk about it?
with May, the follow-up sentence was required. That
Yeah.
was Chris's
Yeah.
feedback on our last draft. We
Yeah.
couldn't just say May. We had to say, therefore, we've decided to.
Got it.
Okay.
We'll
I
take a
think-
look at that.
While you're on that piece of the conversation, and if you're gonna do any changes, I would say you'd wanna lead with the fact that, transportation is a privilege and not required or mandated for most students. But the EWSD district, ta-da, because, you know, I think that sets the tone right there because it isn't federally mandated.
Yeah, it's too-
And I think that should be the lead-in, and then this is how we will
Right.
do it.
But again, I want to say it's our intention,
Yep.
not that we are absolutely going to do, because we know we may not be capable of
Right.
doing it. Okay. Are we ready to, we're more than ready to move on? Beth, you're up. Beth, do you want to try to do your superintendent's report? Or do you
I
want?
can't, sorry, you just froze for 2 minutes.
Okay.
Everybody
Why
has
is your
it.
face frozen?
We have
I
it.
could do it, I don't know if people can hear me, or people could ask me questions about it.
Maybe yeah, we do have a copy of this, so maybe that's the best thing to do, given the time. Do folks have questions about Beth's report?
Beth, is there another, I know in talking to Karen Zadowski for another purpose, and hearing from some community members about the success of the nutrition advisory group, I know Karen is working on another advisory group possibly coming up in January, and I think it's because it's in alignment with adherence to something that our district is regarding healthy youth. I don't know if you can speak to that or if I'm getting it wrong.
I actually don't know. I thought that they were planning on another meeting, if that's your question, yes, but I don't know the second part of it. Were you asking whether they were going to?
I think she may have another subject coming up and I'm trying to, I can't recall her title exactly.
She's our
Karen?
wellness coordinator.
Wellness coordinator. So in the category of wellness, I believe she's got another themed sort of advisory group coming together after the beginning of the year. And I just couldn't recall what the topic was going to be. And I didn't know if you knew, because it seemed in the conversation with her that these ideas of bringing advisory groups together around topics are to help inform, the work that's happening around that topic of wellness in our district.
Yes, and the reason why I put this in here is because of the outcome about each student is physically active and has access to healthy food choices. That's why I commented or drew the attention to that advisory council. So that other advisory council may happen if it's not part of one of the outcomes, which I'm sure it is if it's wellness. I just haven't heard about the topic or what she's doing within that.
No problem at all. I just happened to talk to her through another channel and was encouraged to hear about the sort of convening around the idea of wellness. So.
Other questions or comments?
No.
Okay.
I have one added thing that I did miss when I sent it out, is that the Westford School will begin locking their doors beginning Monday, December 3rd. I just think the board should know that.
Okay.
Their front door.
Front door.
Yeah. Others have been locked. Yeah. Okay, any other questions or comments? All right, let's move on to testing updates on communication.
Yeah, so the big update is the summit is happening on Saturday. So I know I've invited you many times, and this is another invitation. We have over 40 RSVPs right now, so which is great. The week before, a lot of people don't RSVP, so we are expecting a good turnout. 8:30 to 12:30 at Essex Middle School. You don't have to RSVP, so please come if you can last minute. We have some great presenters, and the format of the day and all of our facilitators are trained and ready to go, and so please come. It's been a tremendous amount of work from our Voices team, and that's where we are. We also...
Not to put you on the spot at all, Laura, but I think we are hoping to get more student participation. Not you necessarily, but if you have an avenue for spreading the word, I think Tess was going to do some of that this week.
Ashell and Tess are both working on that. Ashell is going to be speaking at Student Government tomorrow, and there's a lot of working on getting students there. Right now, we actually only have about 6 students signed up, but we're hopeful that it's in the daily announcements. It's going to be at Student Government. The Diversity Club is meeting about it. Hopefully, we're going to be what's happening this week in the buildings is going to help get some students there. But yes, Laura, anything that you can do to spread the word.
There'll be donuts, right? There'll be something early in the morning since it's early for kids.
Okay. Anything else for
Lily and Pat.
communications?
Lily and Pat, we continue to work on the takeaways and the monthly. And I don't think there's anything else this month.
Can we skip transportation?
Please.
Negotiations, Kim?
We'll have an update in executive session before the next meeting.
Next
On the 4th,
Tuesday.
on Tuesday. And our exchange of proposals is happening. It was actually potentially going to be on the 5th, but I think it's pushed back to that following week. The teachers just said they were close but not quite ready. So, that our sort of overview of our proposal that will be shared in executive session at this point, I think, is just for the teachers because we begin with support staff after the first of the year. I think January, February for exchange of proposals, so we'll have another opportunity. If Deb happens to be ready with both and time allows, we might be able to do both at that time, but.
Martha?
Yes.
I got your attention. I was talking to Deb today about that overview, and she feels that's what she did last time she was there, that there's nothing new. So Kim was only there for part of it and then had to leave, but she gave a handout, which everybody handed back,
Right.
about the different proposals, an overview, not a detail, because the board doesn't usually get down to the detail, it's the negotiating committee that does.
Yeah.
But she was a little confused on what else And so was I. I thought, was I not there? And I know I was there, but you know how you second guess yourself sometimes?
I think that was the recollection I had too, Beth, but that wasn't the recollection that board members had. So I was frankly confusing whether or not we had gone into more detail as the negotiating council with her at some point.
Well, maybe I'm just confused because I thought there were going to be more subjects. I thought we really just talked about a single subject as I recall.
Talked about the salary, but then a few other things. There's not a lot going through because we just got through a large one. We're going to have to go back to the table again.
Beth, maybe we'll leave the executive session on there, and we can just wherever there's a language change, and it may not require that Deb be there. If the content is minimal, you and I could do it, or the negotiating council could share with the board.
Okay.
That's good. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Also, under testings, I have sent you all the form for the superintendent formative evaluation. I haven't gotten a single one back yet, so I'd just like to remind you.
The poll down.
I feel a lot better about not filling
So do
mine
I.
out.
I know, that just made me feel better too.
So,
loves
that we want to do that work in executive session next Tuesday. So it would be helpful to me if I could have your response before the weekend.
Yeah.
Sure.
I gotta talk to Liz after.
Okay. All right. Statewide updates, I think we can skip that, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
were you gonna mention, Martha, the board learning piece for next?
Yes,
Oh,
I'm going to do that under board agenda for December 4th. So on December 4th, this was a meeting that was scheduled to be community engagement, but since the summit is happening on Saturday, it didn't make sense to plan a community engagement a few days later. So we've talked about it at our agenda meetings and decided we're going to use this meeting for an executive session on negotiations, an executive session on superintendent evaluation, and for some board learning. And Nicole Mays from the SBA has agreed to come and review roles and responsibilities with the board. Given what has happened to us this year, it just seems like a good time to go back through that material and do some more thinking as a board about what is and isn't board work. Kim communicated with Nicole today. She's going to send us some homework to do, and she's going to ask that we have it back to her.
I think ideally, again, Friday, so if we could get Martha our feedback on superintendent evaluation. What she said, I think she's going to send us is just a little bit of reading, but then a sort of a self-assessment for where we think we are as a board, and what she's going to try and gather from that is sort of areas where there's a wide range of opinion on where we are, or areas where there's greatest concern, so that she can tailor the conversation to what she's noticing from all of our responses. So if we can get her responses by Friday, I did ask her in my most recent email if Saturday was okay so people would have a non-work day to look at it. She would get it back to Martha for Monday or whenever, and it will help inform how she tailors the conversation that she'll facilitate around roles and responsibilities. I think she's giving us those links tomorrow, and then Martha can send them out to all of us. And at that point, she can also let you know that whether it's a Friday deadline or a Saturday deadline, but hopefully that can work for
Okay.
folks.
All right, great. Communication to the community. Probably a little bit about the financial review, the promise and return, and that we're still working on the transportation.
Getting closer.
policy. Hopefully. Anything else?
You gonna ask
For
for
takeaways.
agenda item? Oh, for takeaway.
Those were the takeaways. I just outlined the agenda for the 4th. And that's, we're trying to just keep that to the 2 executive sessions and the board meeting.
Yeah, that's fine. I had one other item that I wanted to
Well,
just,
you could give it to us for the future.
yeah, it's for the future item. One thing that we did in the past is we talked about a morale survey for the district, and I would like to see that discussed at some point.
So what we're waiting on is that the state is supposed to be coming out with a climate
That's-
survey.
I forgot about that.
And this is supposed to be happening for the last 2 or 3 years, which is why we stopped doing it. Beth, do you have any updated
I
timeline?
don't. In my report, I did talk about the review that we will
Hope to say
have,
it's
and
in this book.
in the beginning, that review was supposed to be the climate and culture also. So we should learn through that process when it's coming out. I heard that it's been developed with the new secretary. I don't know. I could certainly find out.
Appreciate it.
This
Thank
one
you.
was really cool.
Yeah, I like that
this
too.
one.
It was good in reading.
That was a
In the
good
building equity book, there's a good one.
This is for-
Right, yes.
Building equity has some great service.
Yeah, that's what Keely is
says,
flashing that
and
around
she
with a
really
big smile on her
likes
face.
that. Yeah. Okay, anything else, Kim?
I was just gonna, because we had the opportunity to talk about it, and in response to the students' report, Laura's sharing with us some experience with the flipped classroom. In talking with Beth, figuring out how that sort of fits in the context of sharing, that is likely to come up on a future agenda, but not probably before the end of the year. More put in context with a lot of the different styles of learning that are happening, and perhaps having teachers share with us some of those practices. But more in context versus like right now. It's more likely after budget. Beth, am I remembering that right?
Right, I put it on either a March or late April.
Yeah, so we aren't ignoring it.
It was great to hear about it.
It's gonna come up in the context of innovative instructional practices that are being used to influence student achievement. And thank you, Kim, because I've written individually to board members who brought things up last time, but the whole board should know the response. So Al brought up the student data system, and so there is a website. What is the name of that thing?
Alpine.
Alpine. I knew it was an A. I'm thinking of names from myths. If you go to alpineachievement.com, I'll send this out to everyone. You can read about the system and what its capabilities are. And the next time Amy comes in, she'll talk about that some more, how they're using the system to inform their work. And Keely had asked about the transportation software, and Brian's gonna do the same kind of thing. He's gonna give us access to a website that will explain what the software does and what its capabilities are. Okay?
Sure, good.
All right, I think that's everything. Oh, Diane.
Future thing, budget calendar, can we, it's,
Oh,
whenever
yes.
you've got it developed, it would be nice to know what it is,
Yes,
please.
Martha was,
I asked for that.
Martha asked for that. Yes, I will send it out to the full board. It's our planning calendar that we've done, those are all identified, those dates, and again, they're hold dates. We may find when we get to the 27th of the month or into February that, just like we did last year, we may choose to move them around.
Sure.
Right.
They're published there, but I will republish them to folks.
Good.
As we think about those dates, if we can plan a long time in advance, if we want one, I know 2 years ago, we did a public meeting where we encouraged people to come in and see the, like, full budget presentation, like, a week or two before the end of the process.
Yeah.
And last year, we didn't really make a big deal out of that.
Yeah,
If we want to do that, it takes a lot of advanced planning to know specifically which day we're doing.
good point, good point.
And we did talk about trying to do
That.
communication engagement around the budget.
Because then it's before it's set in stone.
Yeah,
Right, exactly.
sometimes it's good just for the purposes of having RETN and so forth to pick one of our regular meeting dates in between our budget sessions and just
Use it.
start off, call the meeting to order, go to almost a budget
Right.
information session.
It's good to do a trial run,
And
but
then
it's
go.
also
Right.
great to get some conversation. Thank you, Kimmy. Anything else? Okay, we are adjourned. Drive